Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. The world of crime can be a very dark place. One reckless, violent act can have a devastating impact on not only the victim, but all those around them. In the case of a homicide, the sense of loss and anger never really go away. Today I'm speaking to a couple who were dragged into the world of crime one devastating night 10 years ago. Up until that time, life for today's guest was what most people aspire to. They fell in love, got married, had 3 beautiful children, a daughter Madeline and sons Thomas and Stuart. Sadly, their lives are a lot different today, having lost both sons. Thomas was killed by a cowardly one-punch attack in King's Cross in July 2012. Thomas's younger brother Stuart took his own life 4 years later in July 2016. I was fortunate enough to meet today's guest a couple of months ago at a charity function. I, like everyone else at the function, was blown away by the dignity, strength and kindness they displayed in response to the tragedies they'd faced. Today, Ralph and Kathy Kelly have agreed to talk to me about their experiences and discuss how they dealt with such adversity. It's a deeply personal story. You'll be amazed and inspired by what they have done following the deaths of their sons, Thomas and Stuart. This includes proactively campaigning for behavioural change in the community to reduce violence, the introduction of lockout laws in Sydney CBD, changes to legislation regarding one-punch offences, establishing the Thomas Kelly Foundation, introducing Take Care Safe Spaces in the Sydney CBD, and the youth suicide awareness campaign known as Stay Kind. Ralph and Kathy Kelly, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and I really do understand that talking about what we're talking about, the loss of Thomas and Stuart, how hard that is for you. But my observations when I first met you, and I had heard of you, like I think most people in Sydney, New South Wales, probably across the country have heard of you because of the dignified way in which you reacted to the tragedy that hit your family with the death of Thomas and Stuart. How are you guys coping now? How?
Oh, look, I think it's been a very long 10 years.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been easy on us as a family, as you would imagine. And I think that, not speaking for other people, but I think people think that as time goes on, you bounce back and life becomes normal again, but it's never the same. And, we're still blessed to have a daughter, but she moved out of home about 2 years ago, nearly 3 years ago now. And I think for me in particular, that was very hard because, all of a sudden we'd lost 2 boys and then our daughter left home. We were empty nesters, straight away. Ralph spends a lot of time working away, so during the week. And so for me, that made my life feel very lost and a bit lonely. And, of course, the way we've both dealt with our grief, which, there's no right or wrong way to do it, but I think particularly being a man and a woman, and they deal quite differently, that it put a great deal of stress on our marriage. And, we've just recently done an intensive grief counselling couples therapy program, and Ralph and I went away for a couple of days for his birthday in May, and he was chatting away to me at the table, and something we hadn't really done a lot of for a long time. And I looked across the table at him and I said, "Oh, wow, wouldn't our therapist be proud of us? Look at us, look at us chatting away together." And I said to him, even though I think we've still got a long way to go, I think the fact that we found somebody at last that was really helpful saved our marriage, hopefully.
Yeah, well,
hopefully.
Well, at this stage, we'll say it's heading in a
better direction.
Right direction.
Yeah.
But look, what you've been through, and I've seen this in my years in homicide when tragedy, hits a family like it has with your family. If there's any problems in a relationship, it can just rip the relationship apart because there's a sense of loss, there's the grief, there's the blame, there's all sorts of things. And it was interesting you said that people deal with situations differently, whether it be a male or female. Ralph, how did you deal with the situation? That's Kathy's take on it. What's your First of all, let's just clarify. You think the marriage is going well at this stage?
Look, I think we definitely needed the counselling, and individually we'd both tried to get counselling, but it definitely never worked for me.
Yeah.
I just didn't have a connection with the people I was seeing in the main.
Yeah.
Saw 2 psychiatrists and probably 4 or 5 psychologists and psychoanalysts. And my fear, and this is only recently in the last 2 years, my fear was I'd never had counselling before in my life. My fear was, what if I don't connect? And then I've got to tell the story again, which is very difficult. And so I think on this one for Kathy and I, the lady was exceptionally good, and she supported us both.
Yep.
So rather than maybe taking a side, she was very protective of the two of us, which was fantastic. And I agree with Kathy. We did sit down afterwards, and we both looked at each other and said, had we not had the counselling, this marriage wouldn't be alive today. Yeah. So we've come very, very close to not being married. Because of what's happened in our lives.
Well, full credit to both of you. And it's a difficult situation when you do lose a loved one in the circumstances that you've lost to your children, that people, family, friends don't know how to approach you, don't know what to say. And there was something that I was reading, I think it was something that you said, Ralph, that one of the most powerful things that, or one that really helped was when you're at I think it was a work function, and a colleague just came up to you and put his arm around you and said, I'm thinking of you. And just that little gesture like that was very, very helpful, because I've seen it where people have suffered, tragedy that it shocks people. People don't want to deal with it and they'll avoid you. I've had people, victims' families of homicide, say that friends would cross the street so they didn't have to face them and talk. Did you find that people didn't know how to speak to you?
I think people just they don't know what to say.
Yeah.
If they see you, and still, every day, still now, people don't talk about our boys.
Yeah.
When we see friends, and quite often within the family itself, within our close networks. But the chap who came up to me, I didn't know him particularly well. I'd just seen him at conferences, but it had happened several times. I was at Apple in Chatswood with Madeline one day, and we're just sitting waiting to be served. And this man just came up to me and threw his arms around me and said, just keep on doing what you're doing. And then he took off. And Madeline said, who is that, Dad? I said, no, I've never seen him before in my life. Yeah. And it does happen. And I think those are people who understand, because you don't need to say anything. You just need to be held. Yeah. Both males and females. Like, it's comforting. To be honest with you, when someone does that to me, I cry. I well up, because I think the emotions are still there. They're just pushed under.
Of course.
We suppress them. So it's an experience which is, I don't know, it's just an incredibly kind thing to do. And it's something that I think Kathy and I have learnt in our journey is, with trauma, never try to understand what that person's been through, and never try to add in commentary when they're telling you the story, because you don't know the trauma they're going through. And you can never say, I've been through that and you will get through it, or you can't, you shouldn't judge other people and how they're feeling. And it's so important to that cuddle, listening, and to, turn up with a meal, because, people in those situations are not in good places.
Yeah.
I read a story last night on Facebook, and it was so well written that I had to comment because it was so beautifully written. And this person was saying that they came across somebody in a shop, and the woman, I don't know, the shopkeeper just happened to say through some part of the conversation that she'd lost her sister-in-law in a terrible accident. And there was 2 people in the shop at the time, but one was sort of, babbling on, trying to fix everything. Yeah. And the other person just kept saying, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
And what the person who said they were sorry had said in their little thing that they'd written was that the people just need to be heard. They don't need to be fixed. They don't need to have some magic word said. They just need to let that person speak, like Ralph was saying about listening. Yeah. And because quite often you just need to tell somebody.
Yeah.
How you feel. And I've told people, Ralph and I are very different like that, but I've told people, perfect strangers, about everything we've been through. And quite often later on I might say to myself, what the hell did you do that for, And generally you don't. You only tend to do it with people that you know that there might be an ongoing relationship with, because eventually they'll ask you how many children you have and what do they do and that sort of thing. But, I think just giving somebody a hug, saying you're sorry, not fixing it and letting them be heard, that's a really important thing.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's so many things in the way that people deal with the grief and how you move on, but you never let it go. You don't get closure. There's never closure. There was one thing that I've heard you guys talk about, that you fill out forms. How many children have you got? And there was a situation, I think, Ralph, you put one child, and Kathy, you saw it and said, well,
I got upset.
What are you doing? 3. And just little things like that, but so significant, and I can see how it causes pain.
I think it also it causes that feeling of conflict within yourself as well. Like I remember, I might have been cross at Ralph at that time, but I probably wasn't really cross at him. I was cross that I'd done that myself very early on. Yeah. And somebody asked me and I said one, and I walked away and I thought, I'm never going to do that again. Yeah. Just never going to not acknowledge that the boys existed. Yeah. For the short time that we had them in our lives, it was very meaningful, and, but as you say, you can't really just be telling every sort of person that you meet along the street about that. Yeah.
So let's talk about the boys. Let's talk about the family, or the whole family. So you had a house full. It was Thomas was 18, Madeline was 16, 17.
Yeah, they're about 18 months apart.
Yeah, and then Stuart was 4 years younger. Mm-hmm. So you would have had a house full of teenagers.
Yeah, and we always had plenty of pets, didn't we? So.
Yeah. Describe the Kelly household.
Well, I think it was a pretty normal household, although I suppose by the time they were teenagers it was a little bit more dispersed, because in year 10 Thomas decided that he wanted to go to the King's School in Sydney. Yep. And I think Ralph's father had not long passed away. I'm not sure if I've got those dates right or wrong, but which gave us the opportunity to maybe have a little bit of money to be able to send him there. Yeah. So he went off to boarding school. Ralph was often working in Sydney. We lived in the Southern Highlands. Madeline was a day girl. Stuart was a day boy at the little school that he went to. Yeah. And then when he got to sort of the end of his 12th year, he went to King's as well. So it did become a very quiet household in that way. Yeah. And a bit sad, I think, as a mum, because you live for that buzz. And I wasn't a working mother as far as going out of the house.
The chaos of that household with everyone needing something. And
And I think it made it more chaotic on the weekend when everybody came home, and that was like you had this very limited space of time to get everything done, like the washing done and their stuff. Like when Thomas started working, get all his shirts ironed. And I remember Ralph went out and bought me a Laura Star ironing board, one of those big steam station things, because all I did was complain about.
Now, do they work? I've often wondered about those.
They're pretty good. Yeah. But actually, in hindsight, I think I wished he'd said to me, why don't I just get Thomas and my shirts done up at the laundromat across the road where we're living, you know, during the week? That would have been probably a little bit more helpful, but he did the best at the time.
You tried, Ralph.
Yeah. They're expensive.
Yeah. Yeah, but definitely it was chaotic when they were younger, but in a lovely way. Yeah. When the boys went off to boarding school and it was just Maddie and I, it was probably a little bit, they were still busy, but it was a bit lonelier.
And the relationship your children had?
Look, I think they were pretty normal kids. They weren't kids that cuddled each other and showed appreciation for one another by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. There was the normal fighting going on. And I think because Maddie was in the middle of the two boys, it even stretched the relationship with the boys for a number of years because, Stu was 4 years younger than Thomas. But as they got older, the boys were inseparable on the weekends. They'd go to boarding school, they'd come home and they'd just sit in front of the PlayStation killing each other with whatever game was in there at the time. And but Maddie always had a really good relationship with Stuart. I think being slightly older, she nurtured him a bit and they played little things. She was always probably the boss because she was a bit older. Yeah. But they played little games together, lining up all the McDonald's dogs in the lounge room. They all had a little position and things like that. And Thomas and Madeline used to sort of come at loggerheads a bit. But I think the really sad thing was that when we lost Thomas, he was just 18. She was almost finished the HSC, and they ended up at the same university, obviously not at the same time because Thomas had already, we'd already lost Tom. But I think that would have been the time when they really would have connected because, she was a girl, he was a slightly older guy that could have met all the friends. It would have been very handy.
That would have been handy for both of them.
So I'm sure she has thought about that a lot over the years and what a lost opportunity it was to have that connection. But, they were just normal kids, weren't they?
Mischief. They're getting into mischief all the time. I remember once I picked up the boys from school when Thomas was 12 and so Stuart would have been, 8? Yeah. And they were getting out of the car and Tom went to Stuart and said, we had a swimming pool at the back, and said to Stuart that the last one in is a rotten egg. And Stuart just dived out of the car with his school uniform on and just plunged straight into the pool, fully clothed. And Thomas just looked at him and said, "You idiot." And so Thomas would do that all the time to Stuart. But as Stuart grew older, he grew wiser, and he certainly got his older brother back on several occasions.
Yeah. There must be great memories for you.
Yeah, I think they definitely are. Even the screaming, Stuart had a pretty short wick. If Thomas would go out we had a tennis court at one point, and they'd go out on the tennis court and they'd only be out there for 5 seconds because Thomas was that 4 years older. Stuart hadn't really shot up yet, and, Thomas would pelt the ball into his body so that it would hurt, and 5 seconds later you'd hear Stuart's bedroom door slam. That was the end of the tennis match. Same thing with the PlayStation. Thomas would always, win at some point, and then, the door would slam again. Yeah. So I think
they loved each other.
They did love each other.
Well, it's that. It sounds like that typical relationship between siblings that you fight, but they sounded close.
And they had nicknames, didn't they?
Yeah, they had some funny
for each other's parts.
Yeah.
That was the boys, that is.
Yes.
Yeah. Cecil and who was it? Cleve.
Okay, well we won't delve too deeply into that, but
it would bring every time they brought it up, they would just scream with laughter in the back of the car.
There was a funny thing that Maddie found one time after we'd lost Thomas, and one Easter, Thomas was always mean. He always called her fat. He was just a mean brother sometimes. And one year, we used to put the kids would maybe go outside with Ralph, and I'd put the Easter eggs on the bed and things like that. Yeah. And one year he put all this fruit on the bed and this little note saying "From the healthy Easter bunny," and she must have taken a photo of that. And then a few years later, or sometime after Thomas had passed away, she found this photo, and I think it probably made her smile and cry at the same time. But he meant well by his nonsense.
Yeah. So, I could see that mixed emotions, thinking back on different things like that. So, 18, Thomas is starting to go out, and I'm a parent. I know that concern, that feeling where your kids you're going to have to, you've prepared them, and you're going to have to let them out into the big wide world with all the trepidation that you get. And the night that the incident happened with Thomas, that was his first night in the city, was it?
It was in the main, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to talk to me about that?
So Thomas and I were living in Mossman together during the week, and then on Friday night we'd drive back to Bowral to be with the whole family. And on this particular weekend, he was going to an 18th birthday party of a friend from work. And I said, "Oh, Tom, where is it?" He said, "Oh, it's at King's Cross." And I said, "Oh, no, look, I don't think that's a great idea. It doesn't have a good reputation." He goes, "No, we'll be safe. The chap's got a private room in one of the venues, and we're just going to have dinner in the city and then go into this private venue, so we're not in the greater part of the cross." And I said, "Okay, look, I don't think it's great, but if you want to go, that's fine. I love you." And that was the last words. And I think the last words that Kathy in a separate conversation had with Tom as well.
Yeah, I didn't know he was going to the cross until probably just before the night. So I rang him that afternoon, and he was having a bit of a nap to try and get himself all ready have plenty of energy through the night. And he was a bit cross when I rang, like, "Oh, what do you want, Mum?" And anyway, I think he told me at the time, unless Ralph told me later, that he was going to the cross. I can't really recall, but he got over his cranks and sort of told me what he was up to, and then he just said, "See you, Mum, I love you." And so it was the last thing he said to me as well. Yeah. So
that's sweet. I would imagine that's comforting, knowing they're the last words.
Yeah, on the time before I saw him, he used to go to the gym a lot, as young boys do, and he went to the gym in Mossman, Military Road, and it was pouring with rain that night, and he said, "Oh, can you, would you come up and get me?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he came out of the gym and he said, "I just want to let you know, Dad, I've met someone."
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, that's fantastic, first kind of girlfriend." Yeah. And I said, "Oh, I'm so proud of you." His big smile and he's really happy. And this young girl was the girl who was holding his hand a week later when he was killed.
All right.
Mm.
So on the night that he was killed, he died 2 days after the assault. Tell me about, and this is a night, it is everyone's worst fear. You get that call late at night, and tell us what happened.
Well, the phone rang. Ralph and I had been watching a movie, and it was about this young boy. Can't really remember the whole story, but there was little things about it. We had 3 children. There's little things about this boy that I sort of said to Ralph a couple of times through the movie, "Oh, that's just so much like Thomas." Yeah. And we knew he was out. I guess we weren't, I don't know whether we were really thinking about where he was and was he safe at the time. We were just watching the film, and then we started getting ready for bed. It was school holidays, so Stuart was home from boarding school up in his room, and Madeline was in her room. They're always just on their own computers or doing what they're doing. And the phone rang, and Ralph was in the bathroom cleaning his teeth, so I grabbed the phone, which was in our bedroom, and it was a man, wasn't it? It was a man talking on the phone. But as soon as he said Thomas, I couldn't, my brain just shut down. I couldn't really even comprehend what he was trying to say. So I said, "I'll just get my husband." So Ralph went onto the phone and,
so this chap said to me, "Are you Thomas's dad?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "You need to come to St Vincent's emergency immediately." And I said, "Can you tell me why?" And he said, "No, I can't. All I'm asking you to do is to come up." I said, "Look, we live at least an hour and a half out of Sydney. It'd be really good to know what's happened." He said, I cannot tell you. You just need to get here." I said, "What's your role?" He said, "I'm a social worker." And I said, "Well, it's 10:30 now. We'll probably be there at about 12:15 in the morning." And I went to Kathy and said, "We need to go up to Sydney now. So we need to let Madeline and Stuart know." They were still awake. So we did that. And I knew in my mind something was very wrong. I could tell in this chap's voice that he wouldn't be saying what he was saying, like he would have told me if it was something minor. Yeah.
And initially you were saying to him, "Well, one of us will come because we've got 2 other children that we can't leave." And he said, "No, you need to both come." And Madeline had just recently got a licence, and because, it was a bit of a distance from the school and public transport wasn't great to school, we bought her a little car. And so we knew that the kids could get over to my mother's place, which was not far away, or to a neighbour, and so we just had to leave them, and they said they'd be fine.
We actually said we'd be back later that night.
Yeah,
is what we said. Yeah, because we had no idea it was in front of us. But I think, when we drove up in the car, my mind was probably like Kathy's, was just going berserk with what happened. I knew something must have been.
I can't even comprehend what you must have been going through with a phone call like that.
It was awful. So we called, my brother-in-law is a medical specialist. Yeah. And so I said, "Kathy, call Gavin." And so she did. And by this stage, it was probably 11:15 that night. And Gavin said, I'm just back from dinner. We're just getting into bed. Let me call St Vincent's, because he knew all of the emergency doctors there. And he said, I'll call you back. And he called back 15 minutes later, and he was on speaker, and he said, "I'll see you there." And then that just confirmed that whatever had happened was seriously wrong.
And I think unbeknownst to us, for a long time, we didn't realise that Gavin had actually seen all the scans. So he knew that Thomas wasn't going to make it before we arrived.
Right.
But, nobody really told us anything. We walked into emergency, past 2 police officers at the front door, and they said, "Are you Mr. and Mrs. Kelly?" Yeah. So kind of, alarm bells are ringing. I think emergency was to the left, and they took us straight past, and I thought, why aren't we going in to see our son? And they took us round the corner into a corridor where we met somebody.
The registrar.
And Margie and Gavin, who was Ralph's brother-in-law, and his wife, and we were taken into a little room where the registrar told us that it was unlikely that Thomas was going to survive surgery, but that's where he was. trying to relieve the pressure on his brain. And I remember he said it'd take a miracle for Thomas to survive, and I don't even know what I was saying, but I said, what kind of miracle? It doesn't make any sense, the things that come out of your mouth. But he did say, he's very strong, and he said he's healthy and he's fit, and so I guess there's a chance.
Yeah.
When we got to see Tom, it was in ICU, which is next door to emergency.
Yeah.
What was that? I think it was.
No, it's in another building.
Oh, was it? Oh, yeah, you mean next door.
It's in the private hospital, I think. And it wasn't until 4:00 on Sunday morning that they allowed us to see him. And the neurologist said to us his intracranial pressure, which is the pressure on the brain from an injury, is at 60, whereas yours and mine would be 3 or 4.
Right.
And they said, we've never seen people survive at a level of 60. He needs, the ICP readout needs to drop to below
20 or something.
Below 20 for him to survive.
Yeah.
And so we spent that entire night talking to him. Thomas, you're strong. You can, you'll get through this.
So you're sitting there with him in the room?
In the ICU.
And we were watching the machine, the levels. And sorry.
That's okay. And it did drop to 20, and we're like going, oh my God, he's going to be okay. But then a few hours later, it started to just creep right back up.
Yeah.
And the neurologist said, we believe he's brain dead. And, Kathy and I spoke about, well, what if he survives and he's not in good shape? And I said, Kathy, I don't think Thomas, I don't think we should keep him alive if that's the case, because I know that he wouldn't want to survive.
Whereas I think at the time, and not saying that we're different, but I said, I don't care what he's like.
Yeah.
We have to do everything. But I think unbeknownst to us, because we hadn't really spoken, the neurologist met us after the surgery before they took us in. But there was not really a doctor there that we sort of knew that evening until the early hours of the next morning. And so nobody really explained to us that even if it went to 20, the damage was already done. He would never have had any brain function whatsoever. So, and I think a lot of people thought that we had well, I suppose we did, but I suppose people think that we, made the decision to turn the life support off that couple of days later, but the decision was made for us. They told us that Thomas was brain dead.
Yeah.
And in fact, he was probably, his pupils were fixed at the scene, so he was probably already gone anyway. And the only thing that kept him alive was trying to relieve the pressure on his brain and then having him intubated. So,
and being in a violent attack, Tom had no marks on his face at all, nothing. There was no bruising, no swelling, no redness. It was his little face, but obviously he was missing half of his skull from the surgery to relieve the pressure on the brain. And it wasn't until, some months, maybe just weeks later, that I called the homicide division and said, can I meet with the coroner to talk about his autopsy?
Yeah.
And one King's Cross person came with me, and someone from the homicide division, Stephen. And the person who'd done, or the female who'd done the autopsy, I could tell she's a little bit anxious, because obviously not many people asked to meet with them. Yeah. And I just said, she said, how can I help you? And I said, I don't understand why there was no marks on his face. And she said, that was my initial response as well. And she said, I came to the conclusion, because he was totally unexpecting the attack, because he was holding his girlfriend's hand and his phone was in the other hand, is that he never saw what was about to happen to him. And his head just went with the punch, just followed the fist. And so therefore there was no mark. Mm. And, that kind of shows you what a coward punch is, that, you out of a taxi at 10:05 at night and 2 minutes later you're brain dead. Yeah. From a thug on the streets.
I haven't even seen it coming.
Yeah.
When you were at the hospital, when you were called out there and the injuries, was it explained to you what had happened? Was it explained to you that someone had assaulted him?
Not in the beginning.
Mm.
It was explained that there was an attack, but we didn't have any. There was no. You kind of go into this. How can I describe it? Self-protection. Everything becomes like a dream. And people call it a bad dream, and that's really what it is. It's something, so unexpected. You know, for years and years you watch television, you see homicides and you see sentences being passed and you think, oh, that's not right. You know, this guy did heinous crimes and they're getting a pathetic sentence. You never expect to be in that situation yourself, ever. Never, ever. And it was surreal. The feeling was like you were kind of out of your body looking down at what was going on around you, with neurologists, head of ICU, doing tests on Thomas to see if he was brain dead. And it was all, I don't know. And then at the end you walk out going, what just happened?
Well, you said surreal. I'm listening to your story and just trying to take in what you're saying. It's surreal listening to your story, so actually living it must have been very much that way.
I don't know.
We didn't sleep for 48 hours. We had no clothes. We had no toothbrush. There was a couch in another room, and the hospital staff, you can try and sleep on the couch. What was incredible, though, about ICU were the doctors and the nurses, highly trained. And ICU means you get 24-hour attention, like every second. Yeah. There's a nurse in there with that person. And they're constantly doing tests, constantly reviewing all the equipment around them. And I thought, I never knew this existed in this world, that people did this amazing work.
Mm. Yeah.
And the head of ICU, the doctor, Kelly.
Well, no, she wasn't the head. So the morning that after we were in there at 4 when we first saw Thomas, Kelly Boken or something, that was the doctor that came on duty that morning in ICU. And you notice the strangest things. I remember she had these, maybe she just did it to make people around her happy, but she had these little red sort of flat ballet shoes on with sparkles all over them. And she was there, I think both the first 2 days. I'm not 100% sure of the second day, but I just remember seeing those little shoes all the time. It was so strange. But she was the one that took us aside that morning. And by that stage, Ralph's eldest sister, who doesn't drive, and her son had driven her in, and they were with us. And she took us into the room, and she was the one that said, I'm 100% certain that Thomas is brain dead.
Right.
So, and then, not long, maybe it was a few hours later, my sister drove from Sydney down to Bowral, and she picked up the children, and my elderly mother was living in Bowral, and she picked them all up, and they came to the hospital, and they took us all in the room again, and she explained the same thing to them. And I don't even remember one of us screaming out anything like, oh, God, or anything like that.
Madeline was studying for the trial HSC and said, Dad, I can't come up to Sydney. I'm too busy studying. And I said, Maddie, you have to bring your books if you want. So she brought her books, but obviously never opened them. Yeah. But I don't know, that was another awful moment, watching your children being told that their brother was dead, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm silent because I'm trying to take in what you're talking about and how difficult it must have been. And I would imagine that on the confirmation that he was brain dead, that the family would have gone in there and said their goodbyes. And
yeah, that was an interesting thing because the family came and, that was a disaster. But, we had the priest was fine. So the priest, was a lovely old Catholic priest that was there, who's since passed away, he came in to give Thomas the last rites, and just all the immediate family was there, like Ralph's sister, my sisters, my sister, Ralph's sisters, the kids. Yeah. Although we couldn't get Stuart in there, and both Ralph's sisters were nurses, and Natasha, who's just up from Ralph in the family, she said she didn't know if she was doing the right thing, but she forced Stuart to come in when they were all saying goodbye.
Is that because of his age? Was that
I think Stuart Stuart didn't want to be there. He didn't want to go in and see Thomas. He couldn't take it in. He was 14.
As a 14-year-old, how
do you deal with that?
How do you deal with that?
Yeah.
And I remember, did she actually get him in the room in the end or not?
She did. Yeah.
She did. And then, but when they did turn off, with the priest, what Ralph was saying is there was a woman who was involved with the organ donation, and we'd already had that conversation. We'd agreed to certain things. They couldn't use Thomas's heart because whilst they said he was brain dead, and the tests that Ralph and I went through those twice with the head of ICU that came on the last day, and the reason they couldn't confirm he was brain dead without taking him off for some kind of scan. I can't remember which was an MRI or a CAT scan or whatever, or both. And the reason the head doctor didn't want to take him off to have that test is they said he was so unstable that he would probably die without us while he was in the room. So he said, we can do all these tests and we can test, and everything sort of proved that he was brain dead. But the very last test they did on the second round of tests, there was a few hours in between that he did, was they took the intubation tube out, and Thomas coughed and spluttered. And so for that reason alone, they couldn't declare him brain dead, which meant they then couldn't take him to surgery alive and use his heart.
Right.
So if somebody dies in the ICU and they're not in the room in the surgery with their heart still beating, they can't use that heart.
Right.
They did use the valves for babies and things later on, but they couldn't use the heart. Anyway, this woman, when the priest was doing the last rite, this woman who was involved with the organ donation collection or whatever you want to call it, she was very I don't know how anybody does that job and does a good job, but we found her quite offensive a few times throughout the things. And I remember saying something, or that head doctor saying something to us about her going behind his back and talking to some other surgeon from another hospital or something about getting it all cleared so they could get Thomas's heart.
Yeah.
And excuse the French, but he said, I don't give a fuck about any of this.
Yeah.
We're here to give your son, I can't remember the words.
The best chance of life.
The best chance of life, and it's about his dignity, and forget about all that.
Yeah.
That's what he said. But anyway, when we were in with the priest doing the last rites, she comes around the corner with all the family around the bed with a pair of scissors in her hand, and I was on one side of the bed with family and Ralph was on the other side of the bed, and she was coming towards me, and I just went nuts and said, go and see Ralph. I can't deal with you. Yeah. And then she said, I'm just come in to get a snippet of his hair for you. I mean, why would you do that when you're in the middle of the last rites with the priests?
Yeah.
Priest. I mean, why would somebody do that? It was
Seems a bit clumsy, doesn't it?
It was so clumsy.
But also knowing that in 5 minutes his life support was being turned off.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was just, look, as Ralph said, the doctors and the nursing staff were incredible.
Yeah.
We've had some extraordinary support over the years. We've met some amazing people. And, of course, you give it all back tomorrow for one more second with your son.
Of course.
But there's just so many areas about, I suppose, all facets of life. But that particular area, organ donation, it was just so badly managed.
Confronting.
And I've always said, that if somebody, we used to put it on our licence, now you've got to go and be an organ donor online. But, back in those days it was about having it on your licence. And I just couldn't understand why they still had to ask the family. Thomas had it on his licence. He was 18 years of age. Why do they have to put the family through the trauma of asking and disagreeing as well? Because initially I said no.
With what you're going through.
And it took our 17-year-old daughter to say to me, Mum, if it was one of us and wouldn't you want somebody to give you the heart or the lung or whatever they needed? And that was how I agreed. But I just didn't want them to touch him.
Yeah, I can understand that. It must have been so confronting.
And I can see why people sometimes don't, do organ donation for their loved ones, because it is so confronting.
Mm.
So whilst it's the right thing to do, it's not always easy.
Not easy.
It's not an easy decision. Easy. Yeah.
So after he passed away, then organising the funeral.
I think just before that, we weren't explained the process at all by the hospital. Nobody.
And I think this is, and if any good's coming from you guys telling your story, people understand, what it allows people to understand, because this is a area that most people don't get to experience.
No, and most people believe that if you're hit down by a car on the road or you drop dead somewhere, that you can be an organ donor. Well, you can't. You literally have to be in ICU. The donor recipients have to be all lined up with a match, and then taken to a hospital for that operation when they receive the organs. But so when the priest left and the family left, it was just, and Stuart left the room, and it was just Kathy, Madeline and myself around Thomas.
Before he died.
And Kelly, the doctor, said it will take somewhere between 5 minutes, maybe up to an hour. We just don't know. So she came in and turned all the equipment off. And then Thomas had no clothes on, and we just held his chest, all three of us held his chest. And I could hear his heart beating.
You could feel it.
Yeah.
But then you could feel it slowing down as it started to stop. It was very quick, wasn't it?
It was under 5 minutes. And then it was 8 p.m. at night. It was quite dark in the room. And, but I could see he was turning blue as he was suffocating.
Yeah.
And
that's the thing people don't understand, that if you haven't got any breath coming in through the machines, or your lungs aren't working themselves, you actually suffocate.
Yeah.
So that's what took him in.
And
the end.
then literally within 10 seconds, and then Kelly came back in and said he's gone, because they were monitoring outside. And
they gave us a few minutes.
And then it wasn't even that.
No, she said you've got like 1 minute or something, and then we have to take him.
Yeah. And then he was, and then the three of us are standing in this room. The bed was taken, Tom was taken, and we're just standing there going, what do we do now? You know, it was just a feeling of suddenly Thomas was there, and then he was completely gone. He was taken off us. And, all of those stages were difficult. I think I probably would have, in hindsight, preferred someone to say, this is what's going to happen. So you understand. He's going to suffocate, he'll turn blue, and then we'll take him almost immediately. So at least you're prepared for it, but we had no preparation. Literally, when the bed went with Tom, we were just looking at each other going, what just happened?
Standing there not knowing what to do. And then we went out to our family, who were all still out in the foyer of ICU. And they kind of all knew that, it was over and he was gone, and we didn't have him anymore. And it's just at that moment it was impossible to describe. And even our own family were trying to say things that were helpful, but they were the opposite. Like I can't remember who it was, but somebody said to Ralph, you're really going to have to work hard, because you and Kathy won't survive this. And I know that's it was said in the with the intention of kindness, but you don't even care about any of that, do you? You don't even care about that at the time. So lots of little things like that are said by the people that love you the most. Yeah. And sometimes the people that love you the most hurt you the most, because they say too much, or they're too opinionated.
Yeah.
But I have to say, not only the hospital staff, but the police were there that entire 48 hours. Someone from the homicide division and from King's Cross, and just did everything. Were very kind. And
they were all in tears. All the police officers, these great big strapping men.
We had to go back after Thomas's organs were retrieved from his body. We were asked to go back to emergency at 2:00 in that morning.
Yeah.
To identify him. And, it was, again, surreal. We went up to the door to go in, and it was locked, and we rang a bell, and 2 police officers were inside. They came out waiting for us and took us down to the morgue under St Vincent's, and where we had to ID him. And
it was like a little chapel it was a closed room, and we walked along this big open area, and they said, "Are you ready?"
Yeah.
And it was like they opened a sliding door, wasn't it? And there was Thomas all laid out, and that was really hard. And I remember saying to Ralph, "Oh, his breath smells really bad," And it's not that I was, thinking my son had terrible breath. It was obviously his body had shut down, and that just little things like that you notice and don't seem like it's logical to even comment on it, but I did.
And then the police had asked us, a few hours before all of this happened, we don't have any leads as to who did this. Would you consider coming into police headquarters in the city and doing a media call out to people who may know the person? And I said to Kathy, we have to do this. We have to go as a father. And Stuart said, I'm not doing it, Dad. He's 14. Yeah. How can he do it? So he said, I'll come with you, but I'll stand at the back of the room. And so we went into Elizabeth Street and met the head of media for police, who basically said, look, we've got a media room. Again, this was all foreign to us. We'd never...
So you've been dragged into a world that is completely foreign.
Completely foreign.
You're dealing with so many things.
And even on the way up into the building, there was reporters, people snapping photos and then that happened on the way up. But when we got into the room, that was...
So then I said to Stuart, you've got to really dig deep and find the courage, to sit with us. And he said, Dad, I just can't, please don't ask me to do this. I can't do it. Anyway, so then they said, it's time to go into the media room. And Stuart was behind me. And I heard him say to me, Dad, I'm going to do it for Tom.
And we kind of pushed him and sort of sat between us, didn't he? Maddie was there, of course, as well.
But we walked into a room, I don't know, there's 30, 40, 50 media sitting in there. And I
Cameras snapping.
Think to myself, I don't understand this. There's crime in the Cross all the time. Yeah. What's so interesting about Thomas's story? And it was, we hadn't slept for 48 hours. We had still had the same clothes on, basically. And anyway, so obviously they asked us to talk about Thomas, what kind of boy he was. We did, and then they all left, and we just waited till they had all left. And I remember going downstairs to the ground floor in the lift, and the lift door opened, and Robert Avadia was standing there. Yeah. He's become, quite a good friend, I'd say, over the years. Yeah. And he just said, I only waited to just give you my condolences, that I'm really, really sorry about what's happened, and it should never have happened. And over the years, I've got to know Rob quite well. He's one of the, there are decent people in media. Yeah. Some not so decent, but Rob is one of the decent people. Yep. I know I can call him at any time for a chat and from there we went and had breakfast in a little shit cafe somewhere back in, close to where we were staying. And it was and then we went into this other weird world of 4 of us instead of 5 having breakfast together.
Yeah. We drove home with one less child all the way back to Bowral, and when we got there was an orchid at the front gate that a family from school had left. But that was...
And then we just went into a world of police and homicide.
You're trying to take on so much, aren't you? At this point in time, had you had an opportunity to break down and release all the emotion, or
no?
Sounds like you were just going.
No,
I don't ever remember. I know there was lots of tears, but I don't ever remember sort of screaming that he was going to die or he did die. Or
I think alone we did.
Yeah, it was all
we
very
grieved
private.
Alone, but then, people started coming with flowers and food to the home, which was incredibly kind of everybody. And for me, that was really difficult because I just wanted to go into a cave, and same with Stuart. Yeah. He just wanted to go in a cave.
I think it was the same for all of us, but I ended up being the one that was with all the people, and Ralph and Stuart retreated.
I couldn't stand it.
Where was Madeline?
I know that
she
sounds
must have been
terrible.
in a room as well. Yeah.
But then we spoke about it, and Kathy said, I can see you and Stuart are really struggling. And so she said, why don't you just speak to the police and I'll speak to the people who are coming to the door and bring them in. So we kind of came to an agreement that, and, the 9 or 10 days or 12 days, no, it was 18 days to catch Tom's assailant. I'd lie in bed at night thinking there's someone out there who killed my son. Yeah. And, I reflect back now on those nights where I just couldn't sleep. And, we'd get 2 or 3 phone calls a day from the police giving us updates as to where they were at. And, in the beginning, same thing, no leads, nothing. We're reviewing all the CCTV. We've got it from all the venues, and we're trying to piece it together, but no leads yet. And I said to Kathy, I've got to get Stu out of here. Do you mind? And she said, no, take him. I can see how badly it's affecting him. Yeah. And so I said, Stu, where'd you like to go? He said, I'd like to go to the zoo in Canberra. Can we go down to Canberra? And I said, yep, sure. So we went to the Burberry Hotel in Canberra. I knew the owners, and they said, please just come and stay for free with your son. And the next morning we got up and we walked into the restaurant. And I was in front of Stuart, and all of the papers had Tom's face on the front page. And it was a Sunday, so it was on both the Sunday papers. And I thought, oh, God, I can't let Stuart see this. So I actually went in and went like that and turned them upside down so he couldn't see it.
Yeah.
And then we went to the zoo that day, and again I'm thinking, what am I doing? My son just died 3 days ago. But I was doing it for Stuart.
Yeah.
And it was a way of, I don't know. No, I don't think any of us processed
sort of
Thomas's
numbing
death
yourself
at all, yeah.
The emotions that were going through the loss, was there anger as well in the fact that it wasn't an accident? This was a crime?
The anger took a while, and I look at Faye and Mark Leveson, 10 years to find, which you're involved with Gary, obviously. He's the homicide detective in that. And that 18 days or 17 days to find Thomas's killer was awful.
Yeah.
And then I started to think about people who still didn't know where their loved ones' bodies were and the killers that have been gone. How do they live? It must be awful. And then, the Morecambes as well.
We got to know them, and you kind of think about how long, 9 years or 10 years it was before they found him. And we were going through that for 18 days before they found him. And we had Thomas's body. It wasn't like he just disappeared. I cannot imagine what that's like.
No, well, the fact that you're even thinking of other people when we're talking about this sort of shows the empathy that you guys have. But where they don't find the body and they don't have answers, it adds to the trauma. Definitely adds to the trauma.
For the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and if someone's just disappeared and there are no answers, like Mark and Faye Leveson going down to the national park on weekends and digging, looking for Matt's remains. But you understand it. Like, it's just, you feel like you've got to do something.
Yeah, and when he met Mark and Faye Leveson recently and in the last 12 months, and but you don't need to talk about it.
Yeah.
You both know you share the same trauma. And so it's, you just say, I'm so sorry about what happened. Yeah. So that's really all you have to say.
So you said it took 18 days for the assailant to be identified. Was he charged at that stage?
He was arrested and charged with murder at that time.
Right.
That's right.
How were you notified of that?
The homicide division called us.
Yep.
The King's Cross person called us and said, he called me about 2 days before and said, we're really close now. We think we've identified the person. We just need a couple more days, but we're very, very close. And obviously I was passing every day. I'd pass on the updated reports to Kathy and Maddie and Stu. And he called me that day and said, we've got him.
Yeah. Did he tell you he was going to apprehend him at the football stadium before it happened?
I don't think they wanted anything to be leaked. So
no.
And I the relief from that phone call, I just felt like, I don't know, it was like the every problem in the world had just come off my shoulders at that time. I went, thank God you have the person.
And wasn't it 1 or 2 days before the funeral as well?
It was, yeah. It was the 2 days before Tom's funeral. So to actually go to the funeral and know that he'd been captured was also good.
But then the whole ride started again when everything started getting watered down, manslaughter, going through the court process, all of that. Saying,
I want to talk about that because that's another part that most people thankfully don't get to experience, but being victims of crime and then having to face the courts where you look at the courts as going to give you justice, but quite often, in my experiences, families walk away with a real sour taste in their mouth that think it's set up for the offenders rather than the victims.
It certainly feels like that.
Yeah. Did your matter go to trial, or was it a plea? It was a negotiated plea.
It was a negotiated
plea.
Talk us through that, because I in my conversations with you guys, I know that's been a sticking point or traumatised you even more.
Yeah.
That your son has been killed because of the actions of vicious assault, and then charged with murder. But then there was a decision to downgrade the charges to manslaughter.
So the way it worked was we had a Crown prosecutor that we weren't terribly happy with.
Yep.
He didn't seem particularly supportive.
There was no empathy.
Yeah.
No, even though he had 5 kids of his own. And he said, look, the courts will give him a sentence somewhere between 0 and 4 years, because people have actually not even been sentenced for one-punch attacks in Australia. Yep. And I said, you're not going to accept that, are you? And he basically said, look, it's all based on the Westminster law, the English law. I have nothing to do with the law that's set. I can only work within the guidelines of the law, and that's really what you're looking at. And I said, well, because we were talking about the charges being downgraded, they haven't been downgraded at that stage. And I said, well, I want you to keep it at murder. I said to the Crown prosecutor. Because
the DPP will ask for your opinion.
They do, and it goes up.
We went in there numerous times,
and it goes up to the director. So your Crown prosecutor goes to the director and says, "I believe it should be kept at murder or downgraded to manslaughter." And so the call came in from the DPP saying, "Oh no, we were in their office in Liverpool Street," and they said, "We have to ask you whether you want to keep it at murder or drop the case to manslaughter. If we keep it at murder." And it's not deemed to be a murder, then he could get out scot-free. And so Kathy and I were given time to talk about it, and we talked about it before anyway. But I said to Kathy, I'm happy to risk this. I'm happy to take or either he gets a decent sentence or he gets out for free, and I'm willing to take that risk. Yeah. And so we both said the family would like you to keep murder. The process after that was that the homicide division are also counselled because they're the detectives, Gary, who make the charge. And so I called the head of homicide at the time and I said, what was your reply to the DPP? And initially the person said to him, I can't tell you. Yep. And I said, please, you need to tell me, I need to know what's going on. And he said to me, we asked it to be held at murder as well. Right. So the family and homicide asked to hold it at murder, but the DPP and their so-called wisdom had just went ahead and dropped it to manslaughter.
But there was also the reasoning around that, and you might have to help me with this from memory, but the Crown prosecutor or his solicitor asked the King's Cross Police to contact a series of medical examiners or doctors to talk about the fracture. So Thomas had a fracture right across the back of his head from obviously hitting his head on the pavement. Yep. And ultimately when we were in the courtroom, we were told that the offender did not kill our son, the pavement killed our son. It's like saying a bullet killed somebody, but the gun was fired by nobody.
I sit here and shake my head that if that's, sensible people are trying to tell you that that's the case, it's ridiculous.
Well, this is even more insensible. Yeah. Because so the DPP said we will hold a charge of murder if in the autopsy it shows that the force of the punch, actually was what killed him. Mm. And so my brother-in-law, Gavin, who'd come to the hospital tonight, it was my birthday, and most males just want to go onto the radio on their birthdays, but Gavin called me and said, just calling to say happy birthday. I said, thanks so much. He said, you don't sound very good. I said, oh no, it appears they're going to drop the charge to manslaughter and do a plea based on information within the autopsy. And so Gavin said to me, please, would you send me the autopsy? Oh, and by the way, I should say, even us getting the autopsy, we were banned from the DPP from getting the autopsy. They wouldn't give it to us. Yeah. And
there's such a disconnect, isn't there?
Terrible. It's just cold.
Well, their attitude is, we don't work for you or your son who's deceased. We work for the state. Yeah. So you got nothing to do with this.
Yeah, I call it intellectual arrogance that they think, we don't have to explain ourselves to you.
So I know a lot of people in some instance, well, not a lot, a few. And so I called in a favour and said, please, can I get Thomas's autopsy? And they said, yep, not from us. Yep. It'll be in an envelope for your reception. And that's how I got it. Yep. And so I gave it to Gavin, and Gavin went through, called back, and an experienced medical officer called back an hour later and said, here's what you want. It's not, it was caused by the punch because of, I can see in the x-rays. And I said to Kathy, fantastic, they'll keep the charge of murder because that's what they needed. Yeah. So I went back to the DPP and told them. And this is another disconnect. What happens then is the DPP go to the homicide division, and again, you may be aware of this, and say we need evidence around the autopsy that proves it was caused by this.
Yep.
And homicide division are police officers. They're not medical specialists.
Yep.
So the instruction can be very confusing to the homicide person.
I agree.
And they have no idea what they're being asked
Yep.
because of the language being used in the email. And there were only 2 people in Australia who could actually verify this. And so they said, we've gone to the 2 people. I said, well, what have you asked me? And the person at the homicide division, who was doing the best they possibly could, said, look, I don't really understand it. I've just asked them to make comments around what the DPP have asked for.
Yeah.
And there was no reply from these 2 specialists. Like a week went by, I said, how's it going? Have you got a reply back? No. And I called Gavin and said, they're not getting any replies. What should they do now? And he said, it's just the squeaky wheel, Ralph. You've got to tell homicide division to just pester them 3 times a day, and then they'll get it out from the bottom of the desk and they'll do something. Anyway, the question that the DPP had asked the specialists via the homicide division was the incorrect question.
So Gavin said, had they asked the question in a certain way, it would have been a totally different outcome.
I spoke to people and I said, what can I do, Gavin? He said, nothing. The question the DPP asked has been answered correctly, but it was the wrong question.
Right.
And so he said, you can't do anything. I said, what do you mean I can't do something? I must be able to do something. He said, there's nothing you can do. They've answered the question. And so then the DPP said, well, there's nothing. We're dropping it to homicide.
Yeah.
And you feel, I didn't have the strength in me to actually, I was like at the bottom of the bottom. I didn't have the strength to fight any longer the DPP. And that was what it was. It was a fight.
Well, we also took in, who was the chap we took in, the criminal lawyer?
Oh, a defence lawyer.
We took a criminal defence lawyer into the DPP, which you don't generally do. And he walked out of there with us after the meeting, and the 3 of us cried in the foyer.
Yeah.
There was nothing he could do. And he was an experienced, criminal defence lawyer.
And see the resources that you have access to and your own intellect that you can argue at that level. Can you imagine other people like that haven't got the connections, haven't got the associations trying to take on the DPP?
Yeah, and I think the only reason we had those connections was because Ralph just kept pushing until he ran out of energy to do any more. But to think that it was so close to had that question been correct and that charge of murder been held, we would have had a very different outcome. But to go in there and be told, 0 to 2 or 0 to 4 years is all he's going to get, and yet people who, commit fraud, embezzlement, they get 15 years. It doesn't make any sense.
As a homicide detective, I tried not to get involved in the sentences because it would do your head in each time if you're thinking, okay, my job's to present to the court, but a situation like that, 0 to 2 years, just does not seem right. Now, let's break down what happened with this offence. That Thomas was just walking along the road, as you said, holding his girlfriend's hand, just got out of a taxi, talking on the phone, and was punched by a person totally unprovoked for no reason.
Didn't know him.
Didn't know him, just wrong place, wrong time. There has to be consequences for actions like that. Absolutely.
And the thing was, they say that the punch didn't cause Thomas's death, but Thomas would never have hit the pavement if he wasn't punched. And the other thing that really astounds me that night was there was another young man who was hit just before Thomas.
Yep.
And they were walking along the same little pathway, the same area, and he was with 2 mates. And he could see this guy coming off the wall, and he said he looked angry.
Yeah.
So he sort of stepped behind his mates. But what did that do? It caused Loveridge to come up and hit him on the side of the face. And so when they got to the corner where Victoria Street and the main street of the Cross join, he realised he was bleeding. So that then his mate said, "What's happened to you?" So they went back to the scene to see if they were going to, I don't know what they were thinking they were going to do, whether they were going to get in a fight or what, but or try and have a level conversation with this person. But by that time, Thomas was on the ground.
Right.
And so he got a little bit of blood.
Yeah.
Then he went on and hit 3 other people that night, and all of their accounts were that it was like, a tennis ball hitting me on the back of the head. It was nothing big deal.
Yeah.
But Thomas was hit so hard that they took a 5'9" or 5'10" young man who was fit. He'd been going to the gym since he'd finished school. He was getting pretty buff or whatever they call it these days, strong boy. That punch took Thomas off his feet.
Yeah.
So you cannot tell me that there wasn't intent to cause harm, which is one of the things for murder. What are the others? All those things. There was
reckless indifference.
Reckless indifference, intent.
Yeah.
There was about 3 out of the 4 or 5 things for murder that in our minds were as clear as day that caused murder. Now, he may not have intended to go out that night to kill somebody, but his actions, that's what the result was.
Yeah.
And, you know, and unfortunately, when there's no consequences, there's no, one-punch laws which have since come in, there's nothing around that, and they know they're only going to get a minimal 0 time in prison. Even if we go back to our juvenile system, they get a slap over the wrist, then they're just going to keep doing it. But if you get, a certain length of time, they might think a little bit more clearly about it.
Well, like random acts of violence, which what that was, the consequences are potentially devastating, like in Thomas's case. So, there needs to be a deterrent. So they dropped the charges from murder to manslaughter. The sentencing, he got 4 years, was it?
So what? Even in that court that day, because there's 3 Supreme Courts in Sydney, the Tower, and then there's 2 of the older buildings, and Loveridge has to accept the charge of manslaughter. So the offender has to accept it, believe it or not. And so we were in the Supreme Court. The DPP solicitor came up to us and said, look, he hasn't accepted it yet. You need to come to the back of this building, where we sat on this really cold 4 walls. There was no furniture in there for at least an hour while Loveridge accepted the charge of manslaughter. So it was like
he was
bad on bad on bad on bad. It just got worse and worse and worse for us. And, he was originally charged for 4 years with parole included. And
that was all concurrent because of all the different people that he hit.
Yeah, so.
Which I still to this day don't understand concurrent sentencing because, since the offender's been in jail, he's been back in court twice, was sentenced to an additional 12 months each time he was back in court. Yeah. But because he was in incarceration, the 12 months each time was reduced to another 4 weeks. So he got out of 2 years, it was reduced to an extra 2 months for completely separate crimes. Yeah. Beating people up in his cell, having a mobile phone, having an affair with a female warden. The list goes on and on and on. Yeah. And you think, why should he be serving it concurrently? That should be a full 2 years.
Additional.
Yeah, it still nags me today, and I think I need to go and talk to the Attorney General because I think they got it wrong. Yeah. Whoever the judges got that wrong, he should have another 2 years on top of his sentence. But what happened is, I don't know, the media had followed our story. So this was about 2 years going through the Supreme Court.
And there was a bit of outrage about the sentence, wasn't there?
Yeah. There was, yeah.
And I think that's a perfect example of where the media really helped us push the case through to get the Crown appeal. Yeah. And I think that, as we've said earlier, media can be really detrimental. It can also be really fantastic.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword.
And we experience both of those things.
No, I think that's I've come from the policing background and now working in the media, and I can see how that is a way of describing it. But I think the important thing is to have transparency on the court matters. So the fact that the public were outraged by the sentence and the media got behind that outrage or perhaps created that outrage, but then he was put back before the court. There was an appeal.
He was on the original sentence that was handed down in the Supreme Court that day. It was a corporate judge, not a criminal judge, right, by the way. So
which also seemed really weird. Why are we getting a corporate judge?
Yeah, you need a criminal judge. Yeah.
And what about the thing that he said about?
So the first thing, the court was full. We actually couldn't even get in as a family.
Yeah, we weren't allowed in. They had to actually remove some of the media so the family could get in.
Okay.
Yet Loveridge had the whole the whole back section, the gallery was all full of his family.
Yeah. But anyway, so the judge right at the very beginning said because the offender was intoxicated, he considered it on the low side of manslaughter, and I knew straight away this wasn't going to be good. The 0 to 4 years was ringing in my ears that this is what's going to happen, and it did. And it was a point that we started to really, I've got a friend who was an SC at the time, and who I'd known since I was 16. We got on really well. And I said, can I come and see you? He said, yeah, please come and see me. And the first thing he said, you have to realise, Ralph, that the courts are objective and subjective in, every single case. They have to be.
Yep.
Which I understand.
Yep.
Anyway, I looked at this friend of mine and I said to him, and he's a very well-known SC, and I said to him, how old's your youngest child? And he said 12. And I said, look, when she turns 18 and if somebody punched her and killed her, what would you do? And he just turned around and said, I'd kill them. I said, that's how I feel right now. And then from that moment, we started to work together in trying to change a number of laws within homicide.
Yeah.
And one of those laws is so if you're affected by alcohol or drugs, it's seen as a mitigating factor, as in Thomas's case. And this is the same for domestic violence and non-domestic violence. Yep. And so we said to the Attorney General at the time, Greg Smith, you need to make it an aggravating factor for all violence, domestic and street violence. And he said, Ralph, I can't possibly, and to my friend, who I can't mention, I can't possibly do that because all our jails will be full, to which overflowing with people, especially with domestic violence.
Yeah.
And we said to Greg in that meeting, how do you expect there to be any change in domestic violence, let alone street violence, if there's no consequence? People don't want to go to jail.
Yeah.
And people who are violent know they're violent. It's not like something just happens to you one night and you become violent. You're normally violent from an early age.
Yeah.
And he just refused to do it. But about 2 years later, the DPP called me and said, the Attorney General has changed the law for street violence, not all the way to aggravating, but halfway.
Yeah. And
he said, you're probably thinking that's not good enough. And I said, well, I don't really understand it. He said to me, it makes a massive difference. The judge actually the sentence will be much more because it's not mitigating any longer.
Yeah.
So that was the first law that we managed to get changed.
There was a comment that Brad Hazzard, the Attorney General at the time, that in one of the quoted from the media, that the New South Wales government has since mandated minimum jail sentences for these kind of deadly alcohol-fuelled assaults, and has put in place lockouts to change the culture of the drunken, dangerous behaviour in central Sydney. So on the back of what you've done, there were changes made to the legislation.
Yeah, there were changes made to not only the alcohol legislation, but also to the homicide law as well.
Yeah.
The one punch law came in. The other thing that happened to us is, you can give a family victim impact statement, as you're aware.
Yeah.
Which we did, but also the girl who was with Thomas that night asked the DPP, could I do one? They said yes. And a young boy who was with Thomas in the ambulance was terribly affected, became suicidal later in his life because of what he witnessed. So can I do one as well? And the DPP said yes. And so...
No, they said no.
No, the DPP said yes.
Originally they said no, and then they let him do it. Yeah. But we had to beg for them to let him do it.
So they stood up and gave their victim impacts, and then the judge dismissed
what they said.
The young girl and the other boy's victim impact statements.
Can
you imagine doing that and you're told at the end of giving your statement it's dismissed?
By the way, that's not admissible.
I know when the victim impact statements came in, I think I was involved in one of the first ones where they came in. Privatera, it was a murder of a 80-year-old lady. And the reluctance with the legal fraternity to have that in, and certain members of the legal fraternity, and not attacking them all, like there's good, bad in every area. But they didn't want it in because it brought, I think, humanity into the courts.
Yeah.
And they don't like that. But of course it should be in there. That's what the courts are there for. It's not, let's not hide behind, well, this is the legislation. The courts are there is to protect people.
But the offender can bring in, with Thomas as offender, I think there were 15 victim impact statements from anybody who knew him and wanted to
character references.
So Brad Hazzard, we'd been dealing with Greg Smith in the beginning as the Attorney General, and then Brad Hazzard took over. And in a subsequent court case, I remember walking out of the Supreme Court and we were going to the back of Sydney Hospital for a coffee, and Brad called me and said, I just want to let you know, Ralph, I've changed the law around family victim impact statements.
Yep.
Whereas before it's just you ranting, an emotional rant about how you feel. He said now the judge has to take them into account as well, similar to the character references for the offender.
Well, look, guys, like full credit to you in terms of changing legislation. I've been involved in changes in legislation for double jeopardy, and I know how hard it is to get any changes in place. But the fact that you've managed to do that and get that one punch law come into play, hopefully it prevents families going through what you've gone through.
I think it does, because they talk about it in school and education. A bit like, if you're going out drinking and you're young, designate someone as the driver who won't drink. And it's the same now. They talk about, because young kids do fight. Let's just face it. It's just part of the. And
alcohol is.
They're on the football field or whatever, so they just learn it, and then they see their heroes doing it, so then they do it. But now they actually. The education system is in, and they understand that if I actually throw a punch and I'm drunk and I kill someone, I don't want to be 8 years in jail.
I think it was good that the terminology of a coward punch too came into play, and that was something that was put across in the media. That call it a coward punch, because there's nothing brave about hitting someone.
And then Mark Speakman, the current Attorney General, called me about 3 years ago and said, look, the sentencing committee want to get rid of it because it's not objective or subjective. And he said, Ralph, I just want to get your view as well, your family's view as well. And I said, well, I think you should keep it because of the education. Young men are being taught this. It's not on. And he said, I'm glad you've told me that, because it is exactly how I feel, and I'll reject the application to have that law removed.
That's good that common sense and humanity side of the law is coming into play. But to remove that, why remove it? Because I think if you want to get a message across to young fellas, if you get on the drink and you get into a fight, there's consequences, and there's nothing tough about punching someone when they're not seeing it coming, and call it a coward punch. I thought that was a good move.
And then Danny, the boxer, got on board.
Danny Green. That was I thought that was very strategically smart in the way that they put. Here's an obvious tough guy, and he's calling it a coward punch. So, no, I full credit to you guys that, it's such tragedy that you've described in so much detail about what happened and what you went through, but making a difference. And, where do you channel your grief, your anger and all that, other than to try? Well,
that's what it is, isn't it? It's channeling it so that you have got something to get up and fight for each day.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing I've always believed is, we all need to have the courage to stand up for what we believe in. And I think it's when, people do, express their voice, whether it's about politics or whether it's about anything, that's when the media starts to listen. And sometimes governments listen and things do get changed, but not always. But it's great when it does, because it makes a difference. And we can't live in the dark ages.
You asked the question earlier, did we get angry? I think when I came out of my darkest depths, I started to meet a lot of people, a lot of politicians, and including the Attorney General that day said, you just need to get up, brush yourself down and get on with life. Nothing's going to change. And I literally crawled out of his office in Parliament House. And it set me on a journey. It made me really angry that anyone could say that to me, especially the Attorney General. And I thought, I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to keep on going, keep on hounding. So I'd have meetings with all these politicians. It was like a revolving door.
Yeah.
I'd just go in. They'd try to get rid of me as quickly as I possibly could, which probably happens to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I just wasn't going to stand for it. And I met with David Gonski one day. We'd started our foundation, and David said to me in one of the meetings, he said, Ralph, I'd never give you $1. And I must have looked really unhappy. And he said to me, I don't mean you, Ralph, I don't mean you. I wouldn't give your foundation $1 because you've only been going for 3 or 6 months. Yeah. And, bearing in mind, he's a very wealthy man. And he said, you need to get a partnership with the university who's got 160 years of credibility to give you credibility as in your foundation. And I reflect now on conversations, and I take out, maybe I could do better than that. So all these meetings I've had that have gone nowhere. So I thought, well, actually, I don't have credibility. And so when I started to go to meetings with a premier or the Attorney General, I used to take someone who had credibility.
That's a good thing, because quite often people get dismissed because you're just emotional. You've had this terrible tragedy and it's just emotion, and people just, I'll let you vent and then get them out of there. But That's a good tactic.
Yeah, so I'd taken emergency surgeons, neurosurgeons, the head of emergency for St Vincent's, Andrew Scipione, whoever was appropriate for the particular meeting. And I'd always walk in with 5 asks. So the 5 asks when I go into a meeting, I'd brief the person who's coming with me, who'd agreed to come.
Usually me. Don't ask any questions. This is what we're asking.
No. If it was a Gordon Fulder from St Vincent's or a Scipione, and I'd say, look, this is the 5 asks. Do you agree? And they said, absolutely, we'll support you. And I remember one particular meeting with Mike Baird, who was the Premier at the time, and Gordian was with us. And I could tell that Mike was getting a bit tired in the meeting, must have had a busy day. And Mike's a great guy, don't get me wrong. He's, became quite a good friend. But Gordian was sitting there going, obviously to himself, he's not listening to this.
Yeah.
And so Gordian goes, you need to bloody well listen to what Ralph's saying to you, and you need to bloody well get up and do what he's telling you to do, asking you to do.
Yeah.
And Mike Baird goes, and okay. So it was like tick, tick, tick. All 5 things were approved. And then I walked out and said, Gordian, how could you possibly say that to the Premier?
Yeah.
It's a bit unrespectful. And he goes, Ralph, I'm 70 years old. Why would I care what he thinks about me?
Yeah. Well,
and I believe in what you're doing, and what you're doing is going to make a difference. Yeah. So it's taught. I've learned so much on self-reflection, other people's conversations.
Yeah.
How can I build on it and make it better?
Yeah.
Through and people want to help. The people I'd asked to come in, they wanted to make a difference.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good strategy, bringing people along with the credibility. I think this might be a time we'll take a break. I just want to say, just on the issue with Thomas, because we're going to talk about how Thomas is deaf, and this is a tragedy of what happens with crime and the ripple effect and the impact it had on Stuart and his tragic death as well. You're making a difference, guys. Yeah, like you have made a difference, and if anything comes from your pain, you've turned something so negative into doing something worthwhile. And I think there's a lot of families out there that have not gone through what you've gone through because of the fight and the tenacity you had to try and make a change and just not accept the system as it is. So, full credit to you.
Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.